Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here in Midori House and from around the world. This week, Kansas City's Mayor, Quinton Lucas, tells us what the prospect of federal forces means for America's city halls.
Now you have a nationwide bit of fascism, candidly, that I think is creating a difficult moment for Americans and American leaders.
Plus, Sir Norman Foster explains how the climate and sustainability conversation has changed over his career.
We were promoting everything that is now called sustainable, green, in the late 1960s, early 70s. So we've been fairly consistent and, of course, moved with the technology. And the technology, we mustn't forget, is a means to improve the quality of our lives.
All that and much more in the next hour, here on The Curator, with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. U.S. President Donald Trump has been in Britain this week for a state visit, rich in pageantry but fraught with politics. There were trade deals and tariffs on the table, tensions over Palestine, and flag-waving nationalist protests in Britain, with Elon Musk fanning the flames. So many were asking how this visit might play out. Ahead of Trump touching down on UK soil, Monocle's Georgina Godwin was joined by Michael Wolff, journalist and author of All or Nothing, How Trump Recaptured America, and host of the podcast Inside Trump's Head. Georgina began by asking Michael if this visit was diplomacy or theater for Donald Trump, and how important really is Britain given his America First agenda.
It's not that important. It is theater. I think there are some people around Donald Trump, and there's many people in the United Kingdom that they can gain some diplomatic usefulness and some diplomatic edge. How much is that on Donald Trump's mind? Not too much. I think for him it's good press. It's anything to do with British royalty is a plus for Donald Trump. And along the way, he's certainly willing to accept any flattery and obeisance that might come to him, and perhaps trade some positive diplomatic edge for that.
So Peter Mandelson's sacking leaves Keir Starmer very exposed. And I wonder, in terms of the fact that people do need to flatter Trump and not bring that up, can it really be kept out of this visit?
Well, no. I think the Epstein story is dogging Donald Trump. And just this is one more aspect that wherever he goes, there is the Epstein story. So I assume that the prime minister is not going to bring this up with Donald Trump. Hey, what do you think of that old Epstein? I don't think that's going to, that Epstein did it again. I don't think that is obviously going to happen, but I think it's just another reminder that wherever you go, there is Jeffrey Epstein. There is the story knocking on Donald Trump's door.
And if he has a big press conference, which he likes to do, British journalists will bring it up.
Yeah, there's so many British aspects of this story. Ghislaine Maxwell, obviously. But, Trump is there's nobody better at talking over a question or lecturing why that question should not be asked. And I'm sure, his defense, his Epstein defense has been to attack anyone who brings this up. And in many cases now, more and more, he sues people who bring it up. So I think Donald Trump in any news conference can handle himself.
Trade and tech deals are being signed, we're told. Do they matter as much as the show around them? Are they more of benefit to Britain than to the United States?
Yeah, no, I think surely they're of greater benefit to the UK. But I think it's another aspect that people around, in the UK and even in the US are trying to use this for some positive purpose. But at the center of this, the real reason for this is, again, the glorification of Donald Trump.
We've seen nationalist flag protests here in Britain. and Elon Musk piling in on this. Why is he so keen to amplify this nationalist anger here in this country? What's it to him?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a hard one. I mean, it's hard to know, why Elon does what Elon does is hard to understand. Possibly hard because none of us are on our way to being the first trillionaires in history. So he may occupy a slightly different headspace than many of us. But I also think that he believes that this right-wing imperative is the future, that this movement is powerful, it's long-standing, it's transformational, and he has signed on with it.
Nigel Farage and his Reform Party appear to be gaining popularity in the UK, and I wonder how instrumental Donald Trump and, to an extent, Musk are responsible for this.
Well, I think not entirely. I think this is a movement not just in the US and the UK, but in other Western countries also. But having said that, I think everybody sees Donald Trump, and he provides a model, and he provides a motivation, and for Farage, he's provided support and tutelage. The last big visit here of when Trump came to the UK, I was here with Steve Bannon, who was, among other things, tutoring Nigel Farage.
What's Trump's priority on this trip? What does he want?
He wants what he always wants, to be at the center of attention. I mean, he doesn't think much further than that.
So when the visit ends, do you expect to see a strengthened UK-US relationship? Or does Britain risk just becoming a backdrop in Trump's culture wars rather than having any kind of serious diplomatic exchange?
Yeah, I think the latter. But I think that's been the course of the UK for quite a while now. I think it predates Donald Trump. And probably Tony Blair was the last prime minister that anyone in the U.S. quite remembers. As
this visit unfolds, it begins today. He's here for a few days. Is there anything in particular we should be watching for?
You just have to keep your eye on Donald Trump. You just never know what he's going to do. I mean, he can lash out, he can lecture, he is in that way also utterly transparent. You'll absolutely know what he's feeling and thinking at any given moment.
I wonder how much of a political risk it is then for Keir Starmer.
It's a risk. Starmer has played this by a very clear playbook. Flatter, 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 suck, 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 kiss, kiss, kiss. And that so far, I think, has kept the game going. I wouldn't necessarily say it has paid off, but has kept them in the game. But that could change on a dime.
That was the journalist and author Michael Wolff in conversation with Monocle's Georgina Godwin for Tuesday's edition of The Globalist. And Michael Wolff joins Georgina Godwin for an extended interview on this week's edition of Meet the Writers. Just head to our website, monocle.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. Staying on the topic of the US president now, last weekend's installment of The Foreign Desk took a look at Donald Trump's campaign against America's big Democrat-run cities. Quinton Lucas, mayor of Kansas City, is one of those in Trump's sights. He spoke to Monocle's Andrew Mueller, who began by asking about the recent statement by White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt, who said that President Trump would love to do this in every Democrat-run city.
I think the president is still more of a showman and an entertainer than he has any interest in substance. And my view has been that the president is picking on the largest cities in America first. That's why you've heard discussion of Los Angeles and Chicago. Does he get to every Democratic city? I don't think there are enough National Guardsmen. I don't think there's enough energy and interest to do so. So we are operating day in and day out. And last week I met with a group of Black mayors in America. You'll note that Of the cities that have been attacked or under his interest, almost all of them have been run by a black mayor.
I was about to ask if you noticed a pattern emerging there.
Yes, and I think we've all seen that. I talked to the mayor of Los Angeles last week, Karen Bass, who was noting that. We think we are getting picked on. You're hearing that now. And so, look, it is a broader concern, but I would say this very simply. They create very serious concerns, but they're not serious people. And so I do think the president will deploy on a whim. That being said, trying to predict what Donald Trump will do is in some ways like watching a play that I once enjoyed, The Madness of King George. And I think, frankly, that's what we're seeing in the U.S. now.
I mean, do you have a plan or contingency in place in case one day President Trump does wake up and decide, you know what, I'm sending the National Guard and or federal troops to Kansas City?
I already have started a process. I think last week I was on the cover of a fairly popular American daily, the New York Times, talking about how we do welcome cooperation. We do welcome collaboration with the FBI, with our drug enforcement agency getting fentanyl off of our streets, with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that is helping us get illegal guns off of America's street. That is the collaboration we want. So what we're really trying to do is say, rather than sending us National Guard, send us agencies that are helping our communities stay safe, fighting human trafficking, fighting drug trafficking. Whether that is effective long-term, one does not know, but thus far we have not gotten the attention and interest of the President of the United States.
I guess it must be a closer relationship with Missouri's governor, who is a Republican, Mike Kehoe. You have been unhappy with him publicly about a few things, calling out the National Guard before anti-Trump protests in June. Is dealing with a Republican governor any kind of dress rehearsal for dealing with this federal administration, or is this federal administration something so completely different and bizarre that that doesn't help?
It is a good question. The biggest challenge in America right now isn't actually Donald Trump himself. It is his foot soldiers. It is people like Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy Jr., and it is the governors around the country. Our relationship with our governor is a good one. That being said, when Trump barks, most Republicans in America throughout the states listen. And when he says jump, they all ask, how high? And so for me, probably the greatest challenge is getting through to our governor and saying, but our city actually needs this. We need guns off the streets. We need access to vaccines to make sure that we don't have a spread of polio, of all things, generations after it's largely been eradicated in the United States. And that is where I think we have the greatest concerns. And I would say this about my governor and many others. They're good to work with. They're closer to us. They visit our cities. But they still, I think, are far more adherent to Trump than they are the people of our cities.
Well, just finally then, there could be another 3.5 years of Donald Trump's second term still to go. Do you and other mayors you've spoken to in similar positions talk about long-term plans for dealing with this, long-term plans for trying to address those concerns you were talking about, despite Washington, D.C.? Or, again, is this presidency so volatile that there's no point in trying to plan for anything?
You come up with long-term plans. You come up with long-term plans in terms of how you can have funding sources in states with Democratic governors, which I am not one. You have had people who build out a real apparatus for homelessness support, for example, and healthcare funding. Those are the long-term plans. But the rest of us, I think, are riding a bit of a shockwave. It is a roller coaster in Donald Trump's America. The problem is it's a roller coaster without a seatbelt. And so you're hoping that physics keep you on board, but unfortunately, the wrong turn may throw you off, and you see that happen to real American communities, a challenge to American mayors. And I think it is fair to say that a number of Americans, but not greater than half, are horrified at this current moment. I have not seen this level of divisiveness in our country in quite some time. And I even argue, compared to the civil rights era, where most people actually knew what was happening was wrong. Just so that the people who were in charge of most of the abuses lived in one part of our country. Now you have a nationwide bit of fascism, candidly, that I think is creating a difficult moment for Americans and American leaders.
And there has been a lot of talk, more than you might want to think, about overseas, about where is a coherent opposition to President Trump. Do you think it's something that might grow out of that network of Democratic mayors?
It likely does, either mayors or governors. It will be a non-Washington based type of spirit of influence. I think right now, I looked at polling actually earlier today. We are not that popular as Democrats broadly, but I do think that individual leaders in states and cities are. It will need those types of people who have messages of how they actually get things done rather than Washington that just debates, that I think does make a difference long term for us.
That was Kansas City Mayor Quinton Lucas in conversation with Andrew Muller. Staying with big-name interviews now, and they don't come much bigger than Lord Norman Foster. This year's World Design Congress took place at the Barbican Centre in London, and the event's theme was simple but important. How do we design for the planet? With speakers and guests from all over the design world, this certainly was the forum to explore how the design community can and should respond to climate change. And the urbanist was lucky enough to sit down with Lord Norman Foster, the legendary British architect behind many icons of the built environment, including the Gherkin in London. The show's producer Carlota Rebelo spoke to Lord Foster about quality of life and human-centered design, and began by asking how the climate and sustainability conversation has changed over his career.
We were promoting everything that is now called sustainable, green, in the late 1960s, early 70s. And at that time, it was a fringe activity. And now it's mainstream and everybody's talking about it. So we've been fairly consistent on that and, of course, moved with the technology. And the technology, we mustn't forget, is a means to improve the quality of our lives. Whether that's in a building, whether it's in a city, in urbanity, that is really the power of design. And we have the means to live a good life, to have a quality of life, and at the same time reduce our carbon footprint. We have the technology, we have the means.
One of the other points, when you decided to present two of the case studies of work you've done that you're quite proud of, unexpectedly, they weren't buildings. So I'm kind of going to ask you to retell that story. And we're talking here about the suspension bridge.
Yes, I mean, there was a journalist who was interviewing me and said, you've done so much in London. I mean, what are your favourites? What are the ones that you really rate or whatever? And I said, they're not buildings, because if I talk about the effect of design on the citizens of London and the visitors, then it's going to be Millennium Bridge and it's going to be Trafalgar Square, because those influence the quality of urban life to a far greater extent than any individual building, however powerful that building and important that building might be. And of course, if you take the number of people who cross from the North Bank to the South, which has equalized, so it's brought prosperity to the traditionally poorest South Bank from the rich financial centre of the financial square mile and Trafalgar Square. Most people have forgotten it was a horrendous pedestrian roundabout. You risked your life going there. The heart of London was largely occupied by pigeons and one or two people feeding them. And so the transformational effect of what we did there has been revolutionary. It's now become the living room of London, the heart of London for cultural events, concerts, celebrations, festivities, whatever. So it's perhaps a way of saying that something we take for granted, the infrastructure, the pedestrian spaces, those influence our quality of life, and we can make them better. So it's a plea for the infrastructure of connectivity, public spaces, and cities hold the key to climate change. That's not to say the buildings are not important. Of course they are. I'm an architect. It's my lifeblood.
Are you worried about the pace of urbanization?
The pace of urbanization, it's very difficult to perhaps comprehend that where we are right now. But those parts of the world which are rapidly urbanizing, I mean, the equivalent over the next 25 years is the construction of 11 cities the size of London every year for the next 25 years. So that's a daunting challenge. And what I was doing at this event was saying we have a choice. We can encourage those kinds of cities which have a low carbon footprint, which everybody wants to go to, as Monocle itself as a magazine selects cities, they're all a particular kind of city. They're pedestrian friendly, they're walkable, they have good public transport, they have neighborhoods, they have a historic core. They're not the car-borne sprawling cities, so they consume half the energy. They're more desirable. They're healthier, and they also conserve nature and biodiversity. It's a win-win.
When we talk about, indeed, quality of life in cities, it's all those factors. And almost also then there's this element of community supporting you and enabling that community. We know that one of the main issues that cities face nowadays is loneliness in cities.
Combating loneliness is a killer. It's also promoting exercise, which is health.
And that's where design can be powerful.
I mean, as ever, it's a constant. Everything is designed. It's very easy to think that things happen by accident. It doesn't mean if there's a designer is not involved. Somebody's making a decision. We live in a man-made world.
Your foundation sits in Spain, and that's just 2 hours away. And often we talk about how just a slight adjustment in perspective can boost creativity, can allow us to see things differently. And I'm curious if splitting your time between there and here has also had that effect on you, and of course on top of all the travels as well. But does a slight change in perspective help when it comes to finding inspiration?
Yes, the practice is based here in London, and there are certain things the practice can do. There are some things the practice can't do or it's difficult to do, and the foundation can do. And so the foundation has a global reach. I mean, the graduate class that I was illustrating in this talk comes from 23 countries, but they are separate in every sense, legally, financially, and so it's helpful to have a geographic difference. And Madrid, like London, is pedestrian friendly, is compact, is high density. You could argue that also it has, in its growth, it's sprawled as a car-borne model, not to its advantage. And London, notwithstanding the fact that the green belt, which constrains London, so London has not sprawled in a way that many other cities has done. That's a rather interesting difference between the two, because I think the politicians are not aware of that effect of the green belt. It's seen as a developer's opportunity to kind of dilute and divide, rather than a great invention. Interestingly, reinforced at the height of World War II, when the master plan for London, the Abercrombie plan, was drawn up in the height of the war, so as a real gesture of regeneration and optimism for a future.
It's interesting to hear just how the green belt, I guess, also, the 15-minute city, which many associate with Paris, of course, but not a Parisian invention. A lot of these small, in theory, steps to improve quality of life seem to be looking at the past and taking lessons, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, if design has the power to improve the quality of our lives, spiritually and materially, then technology is the means to that. But closely linked to that are the lessons of history. It's a cliche, but it's also a truism. If you want to look far ahead, first look far back. There are links, there are lessons.
I cover urbanism for Monocle. I have no background in design or architecture. I just like living in cities and concerned about what happens in them. And often, I guess, one question you might get a lot is, what would you tell up-and-coming designers and architects? Any advice? I want to actually ask you, what would you say to just citizens about why should they care about what happens in their cities and why they should be active participants in how they're designed?
Because they have a say, and they should make that opinion, their view, they should make it loud and clear and contribute, because the city is about citizens. The words are synonymous. So go for it.
The Stark-tact, Lord Norman Foster there, speaking to Monocle's Carlota Rebelo for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Still to come here on The Curator, we stop off in Washington, D.C. for a tall story, meet the team behind a new publication dedicated to chairs, and we look back on the remarkable career of Robert Redford, who died this week at the age of 89. Stay tuned.
We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. banking is our craft.
You are with The Curator, a weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Jean Autran-Ador is a French-Togolese architect and co-founder of Studio Nada, an interdisciplinary practice based in Berlin and Lomé that combines architecture, design, and research with a focus on local materials and regenerative craftsmanship. She's worked with award-winning studios and co-curated Togo's first pavilion at the 19th Venice Architecture Biennale, as well as its presentation at the Triennale in Milan. Jeanne was one of the stars at Monocle's recent Quality of Life conference in Barcelona. While she was there, Jeanne also found time to catch up with our own Ed Stoker to discuss the future of architecture at home and how her work is making an impact internationally. Ed began by asking Jeanne about the shift from working in large studios to leading her own practice.
The exhibition in Venice is called Considering Togolese Architectural Heritage. So it was about documenting post-colonial architecture, like the architecture of independence. Like there is really beautiful specimens of brutalist, modernist buildings that were built like from the 70s to the late 80s. There is not much care or value giving to them in the country. Like some are abandoned, others are still in functions because a lot of them are institutional or are banks, so the banks are still running on. But we really seen the need of documenting this architecture.
I've been to Ghana, and some of their sort of post-independence architecture is well maintained, like Black Star Square, but there are a lot of buildings that are not, sadly. Yeah, it's the same in Togo.
Exactly, and there is a few, like there is one prominent building which is this Hotel de la Paix, which was like a luxury hotel in the 70s, a state hotel. It's on the Lomé front water sea. It's beautiful, but it's abandoned since 20 years. Like our research starting with seeing the need of offering a reuse for this building, no? And to say that this is also heritage. And what's beautiful is that it started with those research, and now we can tell that it already has impact.
Yeah, you've seen an impact. Is there finance that's come off the back of that? People who want to step in and help restore those buildings?
Not yet.
But you're hopeful?
I think the value is already added.
And what about quickly about the Triennale?
The Triennale, so that's a project about waste. So we worked on the topic of textile waste. I
remember seeing this.
That's being dumped, like...
Or that Togo is a dumping ground for a lot of clothes, right?
Exactly. Like clothes that are discarded in Europe or in the global north, and as like there is the promise of them being recycled, but actually most of it is just transport to the global south, and Togo is one of the places where like a small part of these billion tons of clothes is landing. Some of it arrive on these like second-hand markets, but a lot of it is also not usable because the quality is so poor. So we worked with, we focused on denim, on jeans, maybe because it's also one of the only cotton fabric that can has some rigidity or can be still reusable, and brought an installation that talks about this topic as awareness, but also trying to shift from wastefulness to resourcefulness, and seeing some design opportunity in this material.
I mean, that's bringing Togo to the world stage in a way. Those are two projects, obviously, with their origins or being shown in Italy, obviously. What about in Togo itself? I think you were working or finished working on a guest house. What do you want to do? I don't know what the situation's like in Togo, but I know that in some neighboring countries or nearby countries there isn't a strong architectural tradition or formally. So are you looking to shift that as well, get more young architects? Is that something you would like to help do, get more people embracing architecture and wanting to build generally beautiful, useful buildings in the country?
Definitely.
Big question.
No, definitely, and also simply that young architects in Africa in general are valuing traditional materials and knowledge that exist, and which is really rich and which is a wealth that we have to preserve, actually. And like I talked earlier on the panel about craft, but craft is really huge value that can disappear quite fast, or maybe we are in an age where a lot of craft are being replaced by other industrial imported materials. There is really the need to give value again to them and to work with this, so to work with local makers.
And also a possibility to give these local makers a world stage as well, make them their artisanal expertise or their craft expertise be used in projects outside of Togo, outside of Africa, anywhere really. Is that something you'd like to do or are doing?
No, exactly, and to show that material that can be seen as not modern or old, like clay, for instance, to shift the understanding of this material and think that it can be really modern, really beautiful, really well finished, that it can bring incredible comfort into houses, and and I think it's like trying to not follow foreign models, but try rather developing an architecture that belongs to its context.
That was Jean Autran-Edward, the co-founder of Studio Neda, in conversation with Monocle's Ed Stocker. Stay in the world of architecture and design now, as our next highlight comes from this week's installment of Toll Stories. Gregor Scruggs unpacks a heritage feature of Dulles International Airport in Washington that to this day gives the terminal a unique charm.
In a 1958 promotional film for Washington's forthcoming Dulles Airport, a bow-tie-wearing traveler with a cheeky grin on his face buys a Playboy magazine from an airport newsagent, then darts for Gate 29 as the doors immediately close behind him.
The early arrival can spend time and money in the concessions, right up until the last minute.
Called The Expanding Airport, the 9-minute animated short bears the signature of furniture designers Charles and Ray Eames. The couple were good friends with Finnish architect Eero Saarinen, who was busy designing a new international airport for the U.S. capital. He wanted to drum up interest in his ideas for a modern airport through a medium the public could easily understand. The results follow passengers from curbside to takeoff and highlight design innovations along the way, none more so than the mobile lounge. For our Playboy reading friend, making the mad dash just as the doors slammed shut was not actually boarding the plane. Instead, he was entering a mid-century vision of an airport lounge, replete with travelers dressed in tailored suits and reading newspapers, potted plants for decoration, and a sharp briefcase or two resting against a sofa. But this lounge had wheels.
As the lounge moves from terminal to aircraft, the passengers find themselves in a spacious room, isolated from fumes and noise.
Back in the era when boarding a plane required walking outside no matter the weather, Saarinen's plans for Dulles, and ideally all future airports, was for mobile lounges, also known as plane mates, to ferry passengers from terminal to boarding doors. Instead of braving the elements on the runway, 90 people at a time would cruise across the tarmac at a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour. Roomier than a bus and with rugged wheels that frankly looked suitable for off-roading, some mobile lounges also had hydraulic pistons that allowed them to raise and lower in order to line up with doorways on airplanes and buildings alike. In 1962, Dulles opened to much fanfare. The swooping roof became an architectural icon and arguably one of Saarinen's finest works. The mobile lounges entered service and quickly inspired copycats. Montreal's Mirabel Airport was designed around the concept, and airports from JFK to Jeddah employed them for passenger transport. But the rosy vision presented in the Eames video did not exactly come to pass. The jet bridge was invented at the same time that Saarinen was sketching out his mobile lounges, and they went on to become a vastly more popular method of transferring people between aircraft and airport. And as airports grew in size, fixed rail systems ended up proving economical to move large numbers of people between terminals. But Dulles, true to its master design, held on to its mobile lounges. Here, too, the Eames video painted a more glamorous picture than the real-world version. The minimalist interior only vaguely suggests a lounge, and I assure you no passenger has ever been served a pre-flight cocktail during their few minutes tootling across the runway. More to the point, the mobile lounges at Dulles are rarely used for their original straight-to-plane function. From noble plane mates, they've been downgraded to more pedestrian people movers, sending passengers to outer concourses not otherwise connected to the main terminal. More than 60 years after its debut, Dulles has become a major international gateway with flights serving 5 continents. Last month, the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority approved Dulles Next, a 25-year expansion plan that calls for adding a 5th runway, building new concourses, and expanding the Aerotrain. With such ambitious growth plans, will the humble mobile lounge be scrapped? The answer is about as certain as the new departure time for a delayed flight. In 2023, the Airports Authority announced a $16 million investment to refurbish 2 mobile lounges. Then, they'll have to decide whether to proceed with a $160 million upgrade of all 47 still in operation. But the newly approved master plan hints at phasing out the mobile lounges once and for all. Nevertheless, on July 23rd, a defiant Dulles Airport Instagram account wrote, "Despite the rumors and misinformation, our mobile lounges aren't going anywhere anytime soon." Published to the tune of Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. The mobile lounge debate ultimately begs the question of how faithfully the Airports Authority takes their role in stewarding a modernist architectural icon. During a 2003 renovation, they commissioned designer Christian Schwartz to recreate the typeface that Saarinen intended for Dulles. The elongated sans-serif typography gels brilliantly with the main terminal's interior and transports the traveler immediately to the early 60s. Could a similar touch of modernist nostalgia become a permanent fixture even as Dulles grows? I suggest Dulles keep the pair of mobile lounges currently under refurbishment in long-term service. Let them go back and forth between the main terminal and the next closest concourse in perpetuity, so that future generations of passengers can still experience a sliver of Saarinen's design vision. Even as most travelers in a rush will hop on the quicker train, aviation buffs and design nerds alike will undoubtedly make a mobile lounge pilgrimage when flying through Dulles. Today, some passengers treat a gate assignment to the concourses only reached by mobile lounge as Siberian exile, as though riding one is an odyssey to the outer edge of the known universe. But I get a secret thrill out of the chance to experience a living, functional piece of modernist design history, even one that's seen better days. Well into adulthood, I still see myself in the excited boy perched at the front of the mobile lounge in the Eames film, eager to take in the view.
Gregor Scruz there for the latest episode of Tall Stories. You are with The Curator, our weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio. Next, to my show The Stack, where last weekend we were in South Korea to talk about the new title from the same team as Magazine B, the South Korean brand documentary publication. The new title is called Magazine C, a quarterly title dedicated to chairs. Every issue focuses on one iconic chair. The most recent offering, issue 4, is all about the Fauteuil Grand Confort, designed in 1928 by Le Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret and Charlotte Perriand. To find out more about Magazine C, I was joined on the line by the magazine's editor, Soon-Jin Kim.
We dedicated our 4th issue to a very special furniture series, and it's called Fauteuil Grand Confort. It's the French original name, but is mostly well known for LC series. But the LC series stands for Le Corbusier, but actually the LC4, LC3, the iconic armchair, was designed by not only Le Corbusier, but also his very close colleague, Charlotte Perriand and Pierre Jeanneret. So we wanted to respect the credit of the designers. So we followed the original name. And inside the 4th issue, you will be meeting the most passionate, most knowledgeable design lovers because they are passionate people about Bauhaus designs, mid-century designs, timeless classics, and you will be able to see more stories, not only in Le Corbusier, but the users all around the world who are trying to incorporate their iconic design into their own lifestyle and everyday life.
I have a question for your group. Of course, as I said, you're based in Seoul, in South Korea. But do you have teams outside South Korea? Because when you read magazine C, it's so knowledgeable. It feels like it was made for insiders as well, for people that know the brands, that know who is collecting what. How does that work? Do you have special eyes around every capitals of the world?
I always get these questions because especially for our segment called 5 Cities, 5 Homes, where we visit 5 different homes all around the world, has that one iconic chair. And it's pretty tricky for us to find the homes and design collectors the exact iconic chair at their home. But also, we are part of, our team has a very deep background experiences in design field, including my director who has worked in design field more than 20 years. So she has been around the whole world, including Milan Design Week, London Design Week, everything. So all those networks we have built, they're a big help as a correspondent, but also always visiting the manufacturing factory and the headquarters of the manufacturing companies. So that also helps our knowledge.
Sunjin, and now I have kind of a personal question about the South Korean magazine market, because we've been discussing from many countries, especially the US and in Europe. Is it quite a healthy market? Do you feel are South Koreans still going there and buying their magazines on a newsstand? And this is not just for your magazine, but in general, what's kind of your perception about that?
I mean, many people doubt about the life of magazines, especially printed magazines, not Instagram magazines or online magazines. But I would say on these kind of niche topics, printing is the most appropriate material, I would say, because for especially chairs, it's still a very analog and physical object. And people who love chairs and who want to know more about chairs would still go for the printed magazines and really want to feel the printed stories. Also, I wanted to mention this, the label on our cover, it also works as a label for chairs. It's because we wanted to emphasize that our magazine is not just for the design knowledge, but also we wanted our readers to feel that through buying our magazine, I wanted them to feel that they're owning the chair, because it's not, the iconic chairs are not always the most affordable objects. So, but also at the same time, the chairs are still very enjoyable and delightful object, even though you don't own it at your own home. By just seeing them, by just knowing how it was made, you can still very enjoy the object. So we wanted to emphasize that by the label design on the magazine. So in this case, owning the printed physical magazine can work as the feeling of owning the chair. So I think in this kind of very niche market, printed magazines can still really work.
Sunjin Kim there, editor of Magazine C, speaking to me for last weekend's edition of The Stack. And finally, on today's show, Robert Redford died this week at the age of 89. His career as an actor, or as a director, or as a festival organizer would have earned him a lofty place in the pantheon. He was all of the above. For Tuesday's edition of the Monocle Daily, Andrew Mueller was joined on the line from Chicago by film critic and Monocle Radio regular Karen Krizanovich.
Robert Redford has been with the film industry seemingly forever, and his career has been extraordinary, and his effect has been so various that it is very difficult to know where to start. Most people know him, I think, as a handsome leading man in things like The Great Gatsby, the one that happened in the 70s, or The Sundance Kid, but he was so much more.
Well, he was a handsome leading man, obviously, and generations of journalists owe him thanks for giving any impression at all that any of us look even slightly like that. I'm thinking of All the President's Men, of course. But how early did it become clear that he was, well, if you like, more than just a pretty face and was actually quite an unusual and significant actor?
That's a really good question. I would say probably more around the 80s, although he always felt he was an outsider. And although he was extremely, the camera loved him. Although he did have the heartthrob status, the leading man status, he always felt that he was more than that, or that wasn't really what he was. He went through, he had a very, very long career. He started off winning a Golden Globe and then ending up with Butch Cassidy, which was sort of mid-60s, and just a huge box office success. And from there on, paired with Jane Fonda early on and Paul Newman, just became kind of the person that you would point at for not only being beautiful to look at, great to look at, camera loved him, but also substance. There was somebody in there. It wasn't just a pretty face.
Was that substance at least part of the secret of the success of those partnerships in particular? You mentioned the ones with Jane Fonda and Paul Newman. That's not really the kind... It's difficult, I'm assuming, to carry off that sort of two-hander if you don't have anything going on behind the eyes.
Well, that's exactly right. And we have to remember that when Redford started out, stars were just stars. They were just coming out of the studio period where stars' lives were really controlled. So they couldn't have political opinions, really. And also who they hung around with and how they were photographed was also controlled. So the fact that he had lasting and real relationships with huge stars such as Jane Fonda or Paul Newman meant that there was a genuine friendship there. And we don't really see that these days because of pressures of, I don't know, social media or whatever you might want to call it. But it was almost like there was a real life going on behind the cameras. And that made what they did somehow more important. There was a resonance there. It wasn't just entertainment.
You mentioned there the political views and it being more than just entertainment. And this becomes, I think, reasonably apparent certainly by the time of All the President's Men, so early 70s or so. But how unusual was that at the time, the idea that not just film, but mainstream, popular, commercial Hollywood film should be about more than just entertaining people for a couple of hours?
Extremely rare. I mean, even today, it's very difficult to get a film about an important topic, important, quote unquote, into the mainstream consciousness. And Redford saw this, and which is one of the reasons why he started the Sundance Film Festival. And we'll get onto that. But I mean, he bought the book of All the President's Men before it was finished. And he felt so passionately about the freedom of the press and the dynamism, and also working together with, because they're very unlikely, the characters that Dustin Hoffman and he played were very unlikely team workers. One was intuitive, the other one was very analytical, and it almost was like a lesson in tolerance and freedom, this movie. And it was a huge hit and made a lot of people become journalists in the 70s and further on.
You earlier mentioned the Sundance Film Festival, and we do live in a world now, as I think you, Karen, know better than most, in which you could spend your entire life hopping from one film festival to another if you really felt like it. But how did Sundance stand out in the calendar?
This is what I'm trying to get my head around. It was such a huge anomaly at the time, because film festivals were either sort of glitzy affairs that seemed quite alien to ordinary people, or they were these little bumpy things that were small and not very well arranged. And he took over a film festival in Utah and just kicked it into touch with independent film that he felt passionately about, that these are not only good films, entertaining films, but also films that were more than just fluffy romances, that they actually spoke to our lives as they were. And he really put his star power behind that. Now, he also was a very private man, and he used his star power in a way that was almost like a stealth weapon. I mean, if he was behind it, people took notice.
And just finally, Karen, I think a lot of people around the world today, and certainly many of our listeners, will be at some point firing up their particular favourite, Robert Redford. Which one would you pick?
Well, you have to choose which Redford you want. Do you want the big romance? Do you want the Great Gatsby, which is difficult to watch but beautiful? Do you want the exciting one? It's the Sundance Kid. Do you want the important one, All the President's Men? I'll tell you, the one that filmmakers really like is Jeremiah Johnson. And that one often goes under the radar. But he made so many terrific films. I mean, Electric Horseman. Have a look, spin the tombola and take a grab. You won't be disappointed.
The film critic Karen Krzanovich in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Mueller earlier this week. And that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by Sanimpi and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best of the programs here on Monocle Radio. Thank you for listening.